Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's Arizona. I got the fan going. It's in the afternoon. So today we're going to pick up with excuse me. We're going to pick up with Civil War. We're right at the end. But before we do that, I was looking over my notes in the 20th anniversary edition, and some of the additions that we made earlier, I missed. I'm sorry. I try to keep up with them, but I missed a few. So if we want to go back to page 331, and the header would be Bull Run and Union Failure. So on page 331, the second paragraph ends 3 months later, the Congress, with Democrats in almost unanimous opposition, passed the first Confiscation Act, which provided for the seizure and property the rebels used to support their resistance, including all slaves who brought with the Confederate Army or who worked directly for it. Now, I have some new material here, and this is from James Oakes, O-A-K-E-S, Freedom National, a fantastic book. Yes, it's a big book, but it's really the best explanation yet of how the Union forces and the abolitionists landed on the notion that they were treating slaves as persons under a condition of servitude that could be changed, whereas the South wanted to treat them as property. So on page 331, right after that paragraph that ends the Confederate Army or who worked directly for it, I'm going to add, or have added in the 20th anniversary update, Union occupation of rebel territory answered the question about the object of the war. Increasingly, the stated objective, the restoration of the Union, demanded that the cause of war, slavery, be extinguished. And the first Confiscation Act raised the issue of the status of slavery in the border states. No action was planned there, but the direction of federal policy was obvious: emancipation. Congress, having already abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., in April 1862, then passed the Second Emancipation Act in July that suppressed, quote, insurrection to punish treason and rebellion and to seize and confiscate the property of the rebels. This is from Oakes, page 235. By using the term property of states still in rebellion, the Union used the South's own language against it. Ultimately, however, the Emancipation Proclamation lit the fuse, creating the political will and momentum that then required Republicans to enact actual laws to secure, eventually, the 13th Amendment. Okay, so now we're going to move forward just a little because I missed another one. On page 346. So we're going to hop over. Getting pretty close to where we are now. This is just, I think, in the last couple of lessons. 346, the last full paragraph ending, they know everything that happens. Much more had been simmering with Lincoln and the Republicans regarding slavery even before Fort Sumter. When Lincoln took the oath of office and promised not to interfere with slavery where it then existed, that was only partially true. As historian James Oakes noted, quote, he and his party were committed to an array of policies aimed at the ultimate extinction of slavery. Down here. As discussed earlier, merely through the appointment power of judges, U.S. Marshals, customs officials, postmasters, and others, the infrastructure that undergirded slavery itself would be rattled. In March 1862, 2 weeks before the firing on Fort Sumter, Illinois Republican Congressman Isaac Amoki introduced a bill that would, quote, render freedom national and slavery sectional, in essence confirming that the Republican Party had slavery in its sights. Okay. And we are good now with all of our new material. We are now caught up. So I am now picking up on page 360, and the header is Total War and Unconditional Surrender. Fittingly, Sherman began his new offensive the day after the election. Quote, "I can make Georgia howl," he prophesied. With Chattanooga and Atlanta both lost, the South lacked any major rail links to the western part of the Confederacy, causing Lee to lose what little mobility advantage he had shown in previous campaigns. You have to understand, Napoleon found this out in Russia. Horses eat a lot, and they must be replaced because they suffer casualties and death just like soldiers do. And also, you can run them to death if you're constantly moving large bodies of cavalry like Jeb Stuart or Wade Hampton around. You must have spare horses. So where were those horses coming from? They were coming from the West, California, Colorado, Montana, places like that, and they had to be moved by rail into the Confederacy. Well, after Sherman, that wasn't possible anymore. So this is a very important development because, as Napoleon found out, when you lose your cavalry, you lose two very important elements to your fighting capacity. The first was, at that time, you had no scouts, no screeners. Usually you would put cavalry out in a screen all around your moving forces to keep the enemy from seeing you, but also to let you know who was watching you. Secondly, cavalry provided the ability to turn a retreat into an absolute rout. This was more common with Napoleon than it was in the Civil War, but still, if you have a body of men who are trying to retreat under fire and you send in the cavalry, they either have to stop and form square, or, which by the way, our troops were not used to doing because they hadn't confronted head-on cavalry attacks like the Europeans had, or you throw down your weapons and run. So you lose a big ability to shatter an enemy that's already in retreat. Sherman said, "My aim then," he later wrote, "was to whip the rebels, to humble their pride, to follow them to their innermost recesses and make them fear and dread us," unquote. Graced by stunningly beautiful Dixie Fall weather, Yankee troops burned cotton, confiscated livestock and food, destroyed warehouses and storage facilities, and ripped up railroads throughout Georgia. They made bonfires out of the wooden ties, then heated the iron railroad rails over the fires, bending them around nearby telegraph poles to make what were called Sherman hairpins. Singing hymns as they marched, 5,000 voices could be heard singing "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." The Yankee soldiers had even Sherman believing, quote, "God will take care of these noble fellows." Sherman's army had marched to Savannah by December 1864, living off the land. Despite Confederate propaganda that Sherman was, quote, retreating, simply retreating. This is Baghdad Bob stuff. I'm sorry. His Western soldiers were supremely confident in their commander. Quote, "I'd rather fight under him than Grant, and if he were Mohammed, we'd be devoted Mussulmans," said one Western private. Sherman's success produced an uncomfortable relationship with Lincoln. The president wanted him to aid federal recruiting agents in enlisting newly freed slaves into the army. An insubordinate Sherman, however, insisted on using blacks as laborers or, quote, pioneer brigades to dig, build, and haul, but not fight. Soldiers, Sherman insisted, quote, must do many things without orders from their own sense, and Negroes are not equal to this. So you remember, back when I disproved Howard Zinn's idiotic notion that Lincoln freed the slaves because he needed the manpower, Sherman's view is that of the majority of Union, not to mention Confederate, officers. They simply didn't think blacks were capable of fighting. So no, it would not have helped them to have had large numbers of blacks in the army, they believed. Lincoln, unable to punish the one general who seemed to advance without interruption, could only congratulate Sherman on his conquest. On February 17th, Sherman entered Columbia, South Carolina, whereupon fire swept through the city, delighting many Unionists who hoped for the total destruction of this hotbed of rebellion. Most evidence points to Sherman's vengeful soldiers as the arsonists. The following day, the Stars and Stripes were hoisted above Fort Sumter. Marching north, Sherman further compressed the tiny operating area left to Lee and Johnson. This is perfectly in sync with Grant's broad strategy of operating all the armies together on all fronts. Every army had orders to engage, a strategy to which Lincoln agreed, quote, "Those not skinning can hold a leg." As the end neared, in December 1864, President Davis and his wife attended a, quote, "starvation party," which had no refreshments because of the food shortage. Already, Davis had sold his horses and slaves to raise money to make ends meet, and his wife had sold her carriage and team. He and the other leaders knew the Confederacy didn't have long to live. At that late date, Davis again proposed arming the slaves. In a sense, however, it might be said that Robert E. Lee's army was already relying heavily on them. At the Tredegar Iron Works, the main Southern iron manufacturing facility, more than 1,200 slaves hammered out cannon barrels and bayonets. And in other wartime plants, free blacks in Allegheny, Botetourt, Enrico, and other counties shaped nails, boilers, locomotives, and a variety of instruments of war. Added to that, another few thousand free blacks actually served in the Confederate Army as cooks, teamsters, and diggers, or in shoe repair or wheelwright work. Little is known of their actual numbers, which remain controversial to say the least, or more importantly, their motivation, but it appears to have been strictly economic, since the rebel military paid more, $16 per month in Virginia, than most free blacks could ever hope to get in the South's impoverished private sector. Most were impressed under state laws, including 10,000 black Virginians immediately put to work after Bull Run, throwing up breastworks in front of Confederate defensive positions. I just noticed an error. Page 363. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I don't know if you caught that, but in the third line from the bottom, it says in front of Confederate defensives, plural positions. That's wrong. It should be defensive. So see, even reading through this, you still catch errors. But the notion that the African Americans in any substantial numbers fought for the South is fanciful. I know there's a photograph of a Confederate, supposedly, black artillery brigade. And no one can really pin that down as to what it was, who it was, if they fought, if this is some sort of trick, no one knows. But there's no record of Union units encountering any black Confederate regiments in the field. Just didn't happen. Moreover, Southern resistance to the use of slave soldiers was deep-seated, and Confederates well knew the implications of such policies. An 1865 Confederate House Minority Report stated, quote, "The doctrine of emancipation as a reward for services of slaves employed in the Army is antagonistic to the spirit of our institutions," unquote. A Mississippi newspaper claimed that arming slaves marked, quote, "a total abandonment of the chief object of this war, and if the institution is already irretrievably undermined, the rights of the states are buried with it," unquote. So these two quotations show you once again that the South believed that they were fighting for slavery, not states' rights. This constituted yet another admission that to white Southerners, the war was after all about slavery and not states' rights. Of course, when possible, slaves aimed to escape to northern lines. By 1863, Virginia alone counted nearly 38,000 refugees out of a population of 346,000, despite the presence of armed troops all around them. Philosophically, the Confederacy placed more emphasis on recovering a black runaway than apprehending a white deserter from the Army in Northern Virginia. Once again, shows you where their head was at. The vast majority of slaves openly celebrated their freedom once Union forces arrived. In Norfolk, Virginia, for example, new freedmen held a parade marching through the cities. They trampled and tore Confederate battle flags, finally gathering to hang Jefferson Davis in effigy. Upon receiving the news of emancipation, Williamsburg, Virginia blacks literally packed up and left town. Blacks from Confederate states also joined the Union Army in large numbers. Louisiana provided 24,000, Tennessee accounted for more than 20,000, and Mississippi blacks who enlisted totaled nearly 18,000. Grant, meanwhile, continued his relentless pursuit of Lee's army, suffocating Petersburg through siege and extending his lines around Richmond. Lee presented a desperation plan to Davis to break out of Petersburg and retreat to the southeast to link up with whatever forces remained under other Confederate commanders, which is few. Petersburg fell on April 2nd, and following desperate maneuvers by the Army in Northern Virginia, Grant caught up to Lee and Longstreet at Appomattox Station on April 8th, 1865. Following a brief clash between the cavalry of General George Custer and General Fitzhugh Lee, the Confederates were surrounded. Quote, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths," Robert E. Lee said of the action he then had to take. Opening a dialogue with Grant through letters delivered by courier, Lee met with Grant at the home of Wilmer McLean. The Confederate general, dressed in a new formal gray uniform, complete with spurs, gauntlets, and epaulets, and arrived on his faithful traveler, while Grant attended the meeting in an unbuttoned overcoat and boots splattered with mud. No sword, no designation of rank. Grant hastily wrote out the conditions, and noticing Lee seemed forlornly staring at the sword hanging at his side, decided on the spot that requiring the officers to formally surrender their swords was an undue humiliation. He wrote out, quote, "This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers nor their private horses or baggage," unquote. Lee wrote a brief acceptance, glumly walked out the door and mounted Traveler, and as he began to ride off, Grant came out of the building and saluted. All Union officers did the same. Lee sadly raised his hat in response and rode off. Grant had given the Confederates extremely generous terms in allowing all their men to keep sidearms and horses, but they had to stack muskets and cannons. The men had to swear to obey the laws of the land, which would exempt them from prosecution as traitors. Grant's policy thus became the model for the surrender of all rebels. Fighting continued sporadically for weeks. The last actual combat of the Civil War was in May near Brownsville, Texas. Davis had little time to ponder the cause of Confederate failure as he fled Richmond, completely detached from reality. Having already packed off his wife, arming her with a pistol and 50 rounds of ammunition, the Confederate president ran for his life. He issued a final message to the Confederacy in which he called for a massive guerrilla resistance by Confederate civilians. Expecting thousands of people to take to the Appalachians, live off the land, and fight hit-and-run style, Davis ignored the fact that not only were those sections of the South already the poorest economically, thus unable to support such resistance, but they were also the areas where the greatest number of Union partisans and federal sentiment existed. Few read Davis's final desperate message, for by that time the Confederacy had collapsed and virtually no newspapers printed the news. Davis had used disguises, but to no avail. On May 10th, he was captured at Irwinville, Georgia, and jailed. Call for guerrilla war inflamed Northern attitudes against Davis even further. Many wanted to hang him, but he remained in a military custody at Fort Monroe for a time in leg irons. In 1867, he was indicted for treason and was released to the control of a civilian court. After Horace Greeley and Cornelius Vanderbilt posted his bail, Davis languished under a cloud of trial until December 1868, when the case was disposed of by President Andrew Johnson's proclamation of unconditional amnesty. By this time, Davis had become a political embarrassment to the administration, and his conviction, given the other amnesty provisions in place, unlikely anyway. All right, that's where we'll stop. I do think, upon many years of reflection, that they were too easy on the Confederates. The Democratic Party should have been outlawed. Its sole purpose, if you go back to chapter 5, its sole purpose was the preservation and continuation of slavery. Merely from that perspective alone, it no longer served a purpose that was in line with American constitutionalism and should have been disbanded. Second, it became the font of all extremist violence for the next 50 years. The Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, the Mississippi Plan, dozens, we know the Klan, but there were dozens of these terrorist organizations killing blacks, killing any whites who supported them, killing carpetbaggers, killing anyone trying to establish any measure of Black equality. So I think in retrospect, Lincoln was way too generous, and possibly had he banned the Democrat Party, something else would have surfaced, but not built on slavery, and therefore it wouldn't be perpetually tainted with evil as the Democrat Party is. And it probably would have saved us an awful lot of heartache, certainly after 1960. All right, I will see you guys back here next time.